I used to believe that the quietest nights were the safest ones until the night a stranger appeared at my door and changed everything I thought I knew about ordinary life. Before that night, my world had been simple and predictable, the kind of life people rarely notice because nothing dramatic ever seems to happen. I lived in a small coastal town in Northern California where the ocean air carried the scent of salt through the streets, and most evenings ended the same way, with soft wind moving through the palm trees and the distant sound of waves breaking along the shore. My name is Claire Bennett, and for most of my life I worked at a small urgent care clinic just off Harbor Street, a place where the biggest emergencies were usually a sprained ankle from surfing or a fisherman who forgot to wear gloves while cleaning his catch. The clinic closed at 10 every night, and by 10:15 the streets were already quiet enough that you could hear your own footsteps on the pavement. That particular night, the rain had started just after sunset, which was unusual for late summer along the California coast. It was not a violent storm, just a steady curtain of rain tapping softly against the windows and making the streetlights glow in hazy golden circles. By the time I locked the clinic door, the parking lot was almost empty except for my old silver sedan and a pickup truck that belonged to the pharmacist across the street. I remember standing under the awning for a moment, listening to the rain and thinking how peaceful everything felt. Moments like that always made the town seem smaller, as if the entire world had slowed down just enough for you to breathe. I grabbed my umbrella, stepped into the rain, and started walking toward my car when something caught my attention across the street. At first I thought it was just a shadow moving through the mist near the alley behind the bakery, but then I realized it was a man. He was leaning against the brick wall, partially hidden by darkness and rain, as if he had been standing there for a long time, deciding whether to move or disappear completely. Even from across the street, I could tell something about him felt different from the people who normally passed through our quiet town. He was dressed in a dark coat that looked expensive even under the dim streetlight, and his posture carried a strange mix of exhaustion and quiet control. For a moment, I considered getting into my car and driving home like anyone else would have done, because strangers in dark alleys rarely lead to anything good, especially on nights when the rain seems to erase the rest of the world. But as I took a few steps closer, something in his expression made me stop. It was not anger or fear, but a calm determination that did not belong in a place like this. The rain continued falling around us, and the only sound on Harbor Street was the steady rhythm of water hitting the pavement. That was the moment I realized the quiet life I thought I understood was already beginning to change. I should have walked away that night, because every instinct told me that strangers who appear in quiet alleys during the rain usually bring trouble with them, but something about the way he stood there kept my feet from moving toward my car. The street light above the alley flickered softly, and for a moment his face became clearer through the rain. He looked exhausted, not the kind of tired that comes from a long workday, but the deeper kind that settles into someone who has been carrying too much for too long. I tightened my grip on the umbrella and hesitated at the edge of the sidewalk, telling myself that this was not my problem and that the safest choice would be to leave. Yet I had spent years working in a clinic where people came through the door hoping someone would notice when they needed help. Walking away from someone who clearly was not well went against everything that had become second nature to me. The rain continued falling steadily, and Harbor Street remained empty, as if the entire town had decided to stay inside that night. I took a careful step closer and called out, asking if he was all right. For a second he did not answer, and I wondered if he had even heard me over the sound of the rain. Then he slowly lifted his head and looked in my direction. His eyes were sharp and focused despite the fatigue in his posture, and there was a calm awareness in the way he studied the quiet street around us. It felt as if he was measuring every detail before deciding whether to speak. When he finally responded, his voice was low and controlled, and he simply said that he needed a moment before leaving. Something about that answer felt unusual, because most people would either ask for help or insist they were fine, but he did neither. I stepped closer until the light from the street lamp reached both of us, and that was when I noticed he was leaning against the wall more heavily than I first thought. Years of working in urgent care had trained my eyes to recognize when someone was struggling to stay steady, and even though he was trying to hide it, I could see the strain in the way he shifted his weight. I told him that the clinic across the street had just closed, but I still had access to the exam room and basic supplies if he needed a place to sit for a few minutes. For a moment he did not respond, and the silence between us stretched longer than expected. The rain tapped against the pavement, and a distant car passed somewhere along the highway beyond town. Finally, he straightened slightly and looked toward the clinic sign glowing faintly through the mist. There was hesitation in his expression, as if accepting help from a stranger was not something he was used to doing. Then he nodded once and said that he would appreciate somewhere quiet for a moment. I did not realize it at the time, but that simple decision to unlock the clinic door again would quietly connect my ordinary life to a world far more complicated than anything Harbor Street had ever seen. I unlocked the clinic door again, and the small bell above the frame gave a quiet chime that echoed softly through the empty waiting room. The lights inside were dim because I had already switched most of them off before leaving, but the soft glow from the reception desk lamp was enough to guide us inside. The stranger stepped through the doorway carefully, as if he was making sure the street behind him remained quiet before the door closed. Once inside, he paused for a moment, taking in the small room with its neat row of chairs and the faint scent of disinfectant that always lingered in the air. I moved toward the examination room and switched on the overhead light, which filled the space with a clean, bright glow. The room was simple, just a medical bed, a metal cabinet with supplies, and a small rolling stool beside the counter, but it was warm and dry compared to the rain outside. I told him he could sit down while I gathered a few basic supplies from the cabinet. As I turned back toward him, I noticed how carefully he moved, as if he was trying not to draw attention to the discomfort he was feeling. Most people who walked into the clinic were quick to explain what was wrong, but he remained quiet, watching the room with calm awareness. There was something about the way he carried himself that suggested he was used to staying in control, even when the situation was uncertain. I asked his name out of habit, the same way I would with any patient who came through the door, but he did not answer right away. Instead, he looked toward the window where rain continued sliding down the glass in slow, steady lines. After a moment, he simply said that names were not important tonight, and that he only needed a few minutes before he left town. His voice remained steady, yet there was a quiet weight behind his words that made it clear he was not someone who often relied on strangers. I did not push the question further because the most important thing was making sure he was able to leave safely. I checked his condition the same way I had done for hundreds of patients before, speaking calmly and moving carefully through each step. As the minutes passed, the tension in his posture slowly eased, and the exhaustion that had been hidden behind his controlled expression began to show more clearly. Outside, the rain continued tapping against the roof, and the empty parking lot remained silent except for the distant sound of water running along the curb. The strange part was that despite the unusual situation, the room felt oddly calm, as if the small clinic had temporarily become a quiet refuge from whatever world he had come from. When everything was finished, he stood beside the exam table and adjusted his coat with the same composed movement I had noticed earlier. For the first time since we met, he looked directly at me with a level of focus that made the moment feel heavier than the situation seemed to require. Then he said something I did not expect. He thanked me not with the casual tone most people use, but with a sincerity that suggested the moment mattered more than I realized. At the time, I believed I had simply helped a stranger during a rainy night in a quiet coastal town, but what I did not yet understand was that somewhere far beyond Harbor Street, people were already searching for the man who had just walked out of my clinic door. After he left the clinic that night, I locked the door again and stood for a moment in the quiet hallway, listening to the rain outside and trying to convince myself that the evening had been nothing more than a strange interruption to an otherwise ordinary day. The parking lot was still empty when I stepped outside, and the air felt cooler than before, as if the storm had washed the entire town clean. I drove home along the coastal road with the windshield wipers moving in slow, steady rhythm, and by the time I reached my small apartment, the rain had already begun to fade into a light mist drifting in from the ocean. Harbor Street looked exactly the same as it always did, with its sleepy storefronts and dim streetlights, and yet something about the night felt slightly different, as if the quiet routine I trusted had shifted in a way I could not quite explain. I told myself that by morning everything would return to normal, and that the stranger who appeared in the alley would simply become another unusual memory in a job that had already given me many. The next morning, sunlight broke through the clouds, and the town looked peaceful again, with fishing boats moving slowly across the harbor and seagulls circling above the docks. I stopped by a small cafe near the clinic the same way I often did before starting my shift, and ordered a cup of coffee while the morning news played quietly on a television mounted above the counter. At first I was only half listening while scrolling through messages on my phone, but then a photograph on the screen caught my attention. The news anchor was speaking about a man whose name I had never heard before. Yet the image beside her voice made the room suddenly feel colder. The man in the photograph wore a dark suit and carried the same composed expression I had seen the night before beneath the rain-soaked streetlight. The caption below the image read, "Adrian Moretti," and the anchor described him as someone connected to powerful organizations that rarely appeared in places as quiet as our coastal town. I felt my grip tighten slightly around the coffee cup as I listened to the report explain that investigators believe he had passed through Northern California sometime during the previous evening, though no one seemed certain exactly where he had gone. The photograph on the screen was unmistakable, and in that moment the stranger who had refused to give his name no longer felt like a random traveler seeking shelter from the rain. I stared at the television longer than I should have, trying to convince myself that it could still be a coincidence, because people often resemble each other in surprising ways. Yet the calm, steady gaze in the photograph was the same one that had studied the clinic room with quiet awareness only hours earlier. I left the cafe sooner than usual and walked toward the clinic with a strange mixture of curiosity and disbelief following every step. The town around me looked exactly the same as it always had, with sunlight reflecting off shop windows and neighbors greeting each other along the sidewalk. But now every detail seemed slightly sharper, as if I had stepped into a story that had been unfolding quietly beyond the edges of my ordinary life. And as I unlocked the clinic door that morning, one question kept repeating in my mind, because if the man on the news was truly the same stranger who had stood in the rain outside my clinic, then helping him had not been a simple act of kindness, but the beginning of something far more complicated than I had ever imagined. For the rest of that morning, I tried to focus on my work the same way I always did, greeting patients, organizing supplies, and answering routine questions, but the image from the cafe television continued to return to my thoughts again and again. The photograph had been clear enough that there was little room for doubt, yet the idea still felt impossible, because people like Adrian Moretti did not appear in quiet clinics along Harbor Street during late-night rainstorms. Our town was the kind of place where everyone recognized each other in the grocery store, and the biggest stories usually involved a boat returning late from the harbor or a summer festival on the pier. The idea that someone connected to a much larger world had walked through the clinic door felt strangely unreal, as if the news broadcast and the memory of the previous night belonged to two completely different places. I told myself that even if the man truly was Adrian Moretti, there was no reason to believe he would ever return to a small town he had only passed through once. By midday, the clinic had grown busier, and the steady rhythm of work helped push the thought to the back of my mind. Hours passed with the ordinary routine that always defined Harbor Street until the afternoon sun began to fade behind the coastal clouds. I had almost convinced myself that the entire situation would quietly disappear when the small bell above the clinic door rang again. The sound was soft and familiar, yet something about the timing made me pause before looking toward the reception area. When I stepped into the hallway, I saw a figure standing near the window where the late afternoon light fell across the floor. The man was dressed differently than the night before, wearing a simple dark jacket instead of the rain-soaked coat I remembered, yet there was no mistaking the calm presence he carried into the room. Adrian Moretti stood quietly beside the reception desk, as if he had entered a place he already knew well. For a moment neither of us spoke, and the quiet clinic felt suddenly smaller than usual. The same controlled awareness I had noticed before remained in the way he watched the room, yet his expression carried a trace of something else this time, perhaps relief or quiet gratitude that had not been visible during the storm. He greeted me calmly, as if returning to a familiar place rather than appearing unexpectedly in a stranger's workplace. I felt a brief hesitation before responding, because seeing the face from the morning news standing only a few feet away made the situation feel very real. He noticed the uncertainty in my expression and gave a small understanding smile, as if he already knew what I had seen earlier that day. Then he explained in a calm, measured voice that he had returned for a simple reason. He wanted to thank me properly for helping him when no one else was around. The words sounded sincere, yet the weight behind them suggested that the moment carried more meaning than a polite gesture of appreciation. As the afternoon light shifted across the room, I realized that whatever path had briefly crossed mine during the storm the night before had not disappeared with the rain after all. For a few seconds the clinic remained completely quiet as I stood across from Adrian Moretti, trying to understand how someone whose photograph had appeared on the morning news could now be standing calmly beside the same reception desk where patients usually filled out paperwork for minor injuries. The late afternoon sun filtered through the window, behind him casting long shadows across the floor and giving the moment an oddly peaceful feeling that did not match the weight of the situation. I finally asked the question that had been sitting in my mind since the cafe television broadcast earlier that day. I asked if the name on the news was really his. Adrian did not seem surprised by the question, and he did not rush to answer it either. Instead, he glanced briefly around the clinic as if confirming that we were still alone before returning his attention to me. When he spoke, his voice remained steady and calm the same way it had been during the storm the night before. He said that the world outside our town often created stories that sounded larger than the truth, but he admitted that the name I heard on the news did belong to him. There was no attempt to deny it and no effort to dramatize it either. The way he said it felt almost simple, as if he was describing a fact that had long ago stopped surprising him. I felt a quiet tension settle in my chest, not because he seemed dangerous, but because the situation suddenly felt real in a way it had not earlier that morning. Adrian noticed the hesitation in my expression and assured me that he had not returned to bring problems into my life. He explained that Harbor Street had simply been a brief stop during a longer journey, and that the moment in the clinic had given him something rare, which was time to recover quietly without questions or attention. As he spoke, I realized that despite everything the news had implied, there was nothing aggressive or threatening in the way he carried himself. His presence was controlled and careful, almost respectful of the quiet environment around him. I asked him why he had chosen to come back, when it would have been easier to disappear without saying anything more. Adrian considered the question for a moment before answering. He said that in his world, people rarely offered help without expecting something in return, and that the simple kindness of a stranger was something he did not ignore. The explanation sounded honest, yet there was also a subtle weight behind it, as if the gesture meant more to him than the words revealed. Outside the clinic, the late afternoon traffic along Harbor Street had begun to pick up, with distant car engines passing slowly through town, but inside the room the calm silence remained. Adrian eventually stepped closer to the reception desk and placed a small envelope beside the stack of patient forms. He told me it was simply a way of showing appreciation and that I was free to accept it or ignore it entirely. I did not reach for the envelope because the quiet understanding between us had already become more complicated than a simple exchange. Before leaving, he paused near the door and looked back once more with the same thoughtful expression he had carried since the moment we met. In a calm voice, he said something that stayed with me long after he stepped outside into the fading sunlight. He said that sometimes the smallest decisions create connections that neither person expects, and that the night of the storm had been one of those moments. After Adrian Moretti stepped out of the clinic, the quiet room seemed to hold the echo of his presence for several minutes. I remained standing behind the reception desk, watching the door, as if expecting it to open again, even though the sound of his footsteps had already faded into the steady afternoon traffic along Harbor Street. The small envelope he had left behind rested beside the patient forms exactly where he had placed it, and for a long moment I did not touch it. Accepting something from a man whose name had appeared on the morning news felt complicated in a way that was difficult to explain even to myself. Eventually, I slid the envelope into the drawer beneath the desk, without opening it, deciding that whatever it contained could wait until the end of the day. The clinic returned to its normal rhythm soon afterward, with patients arriving for routine visits and neighbors stopping by with the easy familiarity that small towns create over time. Yet the entire afternoon carried a subtle sense of awareness that had not been there before. Every time the bell above the door rang, I glanced up instinctively, half expecting Adrian to return again. By the time evening approached, the sunlight had begun to soften across the buildings outside, and the quiet coastal breeze moved through the open window behind the reception desk. I finished organizing the last few charts and prepared to close the clinic the same way I had done countless times before, but the calm routine no longer felt quite the same. As I stepped outside, the sky had turned a deep shade of orange above the harbor, and fishing boats moved slowly across the water in the distance. Harbor Street looked peaceful again, with families walking past storefronts and the familiar scent of fresh bread drifting from the bakery on the corner. Yet as I began walking toward my car, I noticed something unusual near the opposite side of the street. A dark sedan was parked beneath the trees where vehicles rarely stopped for long, and two men stood nearby, speaking quietly while watching the clinic building. They were dressed neatly and carried themselves with the kind of quiet attention that suggested they were not simply passing through town. When one of them noticed me leaving the building, he gave a polite nod, but his eyes studied the clinic sign for a moment longer than necessary. I told myself it could have been nothing more than strangers looking for directions or waiting for someone to finish work nearby, yet the feeling of being observed lingered as I drove away from Harbor Street. Later that evening, when I turned on the television at home, the same news channel from the cafe appeared again on the screen, and the story about Adrian Moretti had grown larger than before. Reporters spoke about investigators searching for any clues about his recent movements along the northern California coast. As I listened to the broadcast, a quiet realization settled into my thoughts, because the simple kindness of helping a stranger during a rainy night now connected my quiet life to a story that people across the region were trying to understand. And somewhere beyond the peaceful streets of our coastal town, it seemed that other people had already begun asking questions about the same moment that had changed everything. The news continued playing quietly in the background long after the broadcast about Adrian Moretti had ended, but I remained sitting on the couch staring at the dark reflection of my living room in the television screen. The calm routine of Harbor Street felt farther away than it had only a few days earlier, and the quiet connection between those two worlds was something I could no longer ignore. I turned off the television and walked to the kitchen, pouring a glass of water while trying to decide whether the events of the past 2 days had truly changed anything, or if I was simply overthinking a brief encounter with someone who had already left town. Yet the image of the dark sedan parked across from the clinic and the careful way the two men had watched the building kept returning to my thoughts. The following morning, the coastal fog rolled over the harbor earlier than usual, covering the streets in a soft gray haze that made the town feel slower and quieter than normal. When I arrived at the clinic, the parking lot was empty, and the bakery across the street had just begun setting trays of bread in the front window. For a moment, everything looked exactly the same as it always had, and I wondered if the tension I felt the night before had simply been my imagination. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, beginning the familiar routine of preparing the examination rooms and organizing the front desk before the first patients arrived. The calm silence lasted only a few minutes before the bell above the door rang again. This time the person who entered was not Adrian Moretti, but a man wearing a simple dark jacket and carrying a small notebook in his hand. He introduced himself politely and explained that he was traveling through the area, asking a few questions related to a recent news story. His tone was professional and friendly. Yet there was a quiet focus behind his eyes that reminded me of the man I had seen across the street the night before. He asked if the clinic had been open late during the recent storm and whether I had noticed any unfamiliar visitors passing through Harbor Street that evening. I answered, carefully keeping my voice calm, while explaining that urgent care clinics often see travelers who stop briefly before continuing on their way. The man listened without interrupting, occasionally writing short notes in the small notebook he carried. He never mentioned Adrian Moretti directly, yet the direction of his questions made it clear that he already suspected the town had been part of a larger story. After thanking me for my time, he stepped outside again, leaving the quiet clinic exactly as he had found it. As the door closed behind him, I felt the weight of the situation settle more clearly into my thoughts, because the peaceful life I had always known was beginning to intersect with something much bigger than Harbor Street. And somewhere beyond the fog drifting across the harbor, it seemed that the brief moment of kindness during the storm had quietly placed me in the center of a secret that more and more people were trying to uncover. For the rest of that morning, the clinic remained quiet, yet the feeling left behind by the man with the notebook lingered in the air long after he stepped outside. I tried to return to the routine that had always made Harbor Street feel predictable, greeting patients, organizing charts, and answering the usual questions about minor injuries and seasonal allergies, but each small sound near the front door made me glance toward the reception area again. It was not fear that settled in my thoughts, but a quiet awareness that the calm world I knew was now connected to something larger that had begun moving beyond the edges of town. By the afternoon, the coastal fog had lifted and sunlight stretched across the sidewalk outside the clinic. People passed by carrying groceries or walking toward the harbor exactly as they did every day, yet the memory of the questions from that morning continued to repeat in my mind. I thought about the storm the night before everything began and the simple decision to unlock the clinic door for someone who needed help. At the time, it had felt like nothing more than a normal part of my job, yet now the moment seemed strangely important, as if a single quiet choice had created a connection that could not easily be undone. When the clinic finally closed that evening, I stepped outside and paused beside the doorway, watching the familiar streetlights flicker on one by one along Harbor Street. The same bakery window glowed softly across the road, and the sound of waves drifting in from the harbor carried through the cool evening air. For a moment, everything felt peaceful again, almost as if the town itself was reminding me that life here had not truly changed. Yet as I walked toward my car, I noticed something resting against the windshield beneath the wiper blade. It was a small folded piece of paper placed carefully where it would not fall in the wind. I looked around the quiet street, but no one nearby seemed to be paying attention. When I opened the note, there were only a few simple words written in steady handwriting. The message thanked me again for my kindness and explained that sometimes the safest way to protect someone was to remain unseen. There was no signature, yet I did not need one to understand who had left it there. I folded the note slowly and slipped it into my pocket while looking back toward the quiet clinic building standing beneath the soft glow of the streetlight. In that moment, I understood something important about the strange path the storm had created. The world searching for Adrian Moretti would continue asking questions, and perhaps one day the story would fade into another headline on the evening news. But the quiet truth of what had happened on Harbor Street belonged only to two people who had shared a brief moment during a rainy night. And as I drove home along the coastal road, I realized that sometimes the most powerful secrets are not hidden by fear or silence, but by the simple choice of an ordinary person who decides to protect a story the rest of the world will never fully understand.